Good evening, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight we are telling the entire story of the Second World War. From the broken peace of 1919 to the ruins of Berlin and the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima. From the first trembling steps of Adolf Hitler toward power in a Munich beer hall to the moment a Japanese emperor spoke to his people for the first time and told them the war was over. It is the story of the most destructive conflict in human history. A war that killed more than 70 million people. A war that remade the map of the world, shattered empires, gave birth to nations, and left a wound in the human story that has never entirely healed. Before we begin, if you enjoy what we do here, take a moment to like and subscribe. And while you settle in, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Now dim the lights and let us go back to the beginning. Because this story does not begin in 1939. It begins in the silence after the guns stopped in 1918. The guns of the First World War fell silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. Across the Western Front, soldiers who had spent years living in mud and blood and terror simply sat down in the sudden quiet and tried to understand that it was over. Some wept, some laughed, some sat in complete silence, unable to process the stillness after so many years of noise. In villages across France and Belgium and Britain and Germany, church bells rang for the first time in years. Women came out into the streets still wearing black for the sons they had already buried. In London, crowds surged through the streets cheering. In Berlin, the mood was very different. Germany had not been invaded. Its armies had not been defeated on home soil. The war ended with German soldiers still standing on foreign ground, and yet somehow, impossibly, the nation had lost. Many Germans refused to believe it. A story began to spread through the beer halls and the veterans clubs and the embittered corners of German life. The army had not lost the war. It had been stabbed in the back, betrayed by politicians, betrayed by Jews, betrayed by communists and cowards at home who had undermined the fighting men at the front. It was a lie, but it was a lie that would prove to be one of the most dangerous in history. The men who gathered in Paris in 1919 to negotiate the peace were carrying the weight of 4 years of catastrophe. Nearly 10 million soldiers were dead. Another 20 million had been wounded. Entire generations of young men had been fed into the machine and not come back. The French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau had lived through 2 German invasions of his country in his lifetime. He wanted Germany broken so completely that it could never threaten France again. The British Prime Minister David Lloyd George tried to balance punishment with practicality, sensing that too much severity might plant the seeds of the next war. The American President Woodrow Wilson arrived with his 14 points and his dream of a new world order built on self-determination and collective security. These 3 men did not agree on much, but they agreed on enough to produce the Treaty of Versailles. And the Treaty of Versailles was, for Germany, a humiliation without precedent in modern history. Germany was stripped of its colonies. Its army was reduced to 100,000 men. It was forbidden from having tanks or aircraft or submarines. The industrial heartland of the Rhineland was to be demilitarized. Alsace and Lorraine, taken from France in 1870, were returned. The Polish corridor was created, cutting East Prussia off from the rest of Germany and handing territory that Germans considered their own to a newly created Polish state. And looming above all of it was the reparations bill, 132 billion gold marks. a sum so vast that it seemed designed not to compensate the victors, but to destroy the vanquished. German politicians signed the treaty under protest. They called it a diktat, a dictated peace, not a negotiated settlement, but an imposed verdict. In cafes and veterans clubs across Germany, men who had fought for 4 years and come home to find their country defeated and humiliated began to ask who was to blame. And they found answers. The wrong answers, but answers that felt, in their rage and their grief, satisfying. The years that followed were a nightmare. In 1923, the German government, struggling to pay the reparations it owed, began printing money. The result was a hyperinflation so extreme that it beggars description. A loaf of bread that cost a few marks at the beginning of the year cost billions by the end. Families who had saved for decades watched their life savings evaporate in weeks. A man was photographed using banknotes as wallpaper because it was cheaper than buying paper. Farmers refused to sell food in exchange for currency that was worth nothing by the time they reached the market. People starved in the shadow of granaries. Children played with bricks of worthless currency in the street, and amid the chaos, a struggling democracy called the Weimar Republic tried to hold Germany together while forces from both left and right worked to tear it apart. Into this world of humiliation and desperation came a man named Adolf Hitler. He had been born in Austria in 1889. He had spent his early years as a failed artist in Vienna, living in cheap lodgings. Nursing his resentments, absorbing the anti-Semitic politics that swirled through the streets of the Habsburg capital. He had fought in the First World War as a corporal on the Western Front. He had been wounded and gassed and decorated. He had experienced the news of Germany's defeat as a personal catastrophe. In his own account, it was the worst moment of his life. Lying in a hospital ward, temporarily blinded by a gas attack, he wept when he heard that Germany had surrendered. And in his tears, he found his purpose. He would never allow Germany to be humiliated like this again. He would find those responsible. He would make them pay. And he would make Germany great once more. He was not a polished figure. He was not a man of education or sophistication, but he was a speaker of extraordinary force. When he stood before a crowd in a Munich beer hall and began to speak, something happened. His voice started quietly and built with gathering intensity. He gave voice to everything that ordinary Germans felt, the rage and the shame and the sense of betrayal and the longing for revenge and the desperate hunger for someone to tell them that it was not their fault, that they had been wronged, that they would be made whole again. He was mesmerizing, and he was dangerous. In November 1923, he tried to seize power in Munich with a putsch, a coup. It failed. The police opened fire. 16 Nazis were killed. Hitler was arrested and sentenced to prison. But in prison, he found time to write a book that laid out his ideology with terrifying clarity. He called it Mein Kampf, My Struggle. It spoke of German racial superiority, of the Jews as the great enemy of civilization, of the need for Lebensraum, living space, to be seized in the East at the expense of the Slavic peoples he considered subhuman. Few people read it carefully at the time. Fewer still took it seriously. They would come to regret that. Released after less than a year, Hitler changed tactics. He would not seize power by force. He would win it through the ballot box. He rebuilt the Nazi Party from scratch. He created a propaganda machine of extraordinary sophistication. Posters, radio broadcasts, mass rallies staged with theatrical precision. He gave Germany a symbol in the swastika and an enemy in the Jew. His stormtroopers marched through the streets, brawling with communists, projecting an image of discipline and strength that appealed to people who had experienced nothing but chaos for years. And then, the Great Depression struck. In October 1929, Wall Street collapsed. The shockwaves spread across the world with unstoppable force. American banks called in their loans to Germany. German banks collapsed. Factories closed. By 1930, 6 million Germans were unemployed. Families scavenged for coal along railway tracks. Soup kitchens overflowed. Men who had worked all their lives stood on street corners selling pencils. Children went to school hungry. The Weimar Republic seemed powerless to respond. Its governments rose and fell in rapid succession. Democracy appeared to have no answer to despair. And in the despair, Hitler's message found its audience. By 1932, the Nazi Party was the largest in the Reichstag. In January 1933, after backroom deals and political miscalculations, President Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. The old man thought he could control him. He was wrong. Within months, a fire destroyed the Reichstag building. The Nazis blamed the communists. Emergency powers were granted. Opposition parties were banned. Trade unions were crushed. The press was muzzled. By the summer of 1933, Germany was a one-party state. Democracy had ended with a legal vote. Adolf Hitler was the absolute master of Germany, and he had very clear plans for what he intended to do with that mastery. While Germany descended into Nazism, Italy had already shown the world what fascism looked like. Benito Mussolini was in many ways Hitler's model and his inspiration. The son of a blacksmith, a former socialist turned nationalist, he had created the fascist movement in Italy in 1919 and marched his black-shirted followers to Rome in 1922 to intimidate the Italian king into giving him power. He had not needed to fire a shot. The political establishment had simply lost its nerve. As prime minister and then as dictator, Mussolini created a cult of personality around himself. He was Il Duces, the leader. He bullied the press and broke the unions and made the trains run on time, or so the legend said. He dreamed of a new Roman Empire stretching across the Mediterranean. He glorified strength and action and the will to power. He was bombastic and theatrical and often ridiculous. But he was also genuinely dangerous. And when a young Austrian failed artist began his rise to power in Germany, Mussolini watched with something between admiration and unease. The 1930s were a decade of testing. Each time Hitler pushed, the world retreated. In 1935, he announced open rearmament in defiance of Versailles. Britain and France protested mildly and did nothing. In 1936, he sent troops into the Rhineland, the demilitarized zone along the French border. His generals told him that if France responded with force, they would have to retreat in humiliation. France did not respond. Britain counseled restraint. Hitler had gambled and won. The lesson was clear. Boldness was rewarded. Hesitation was weakness. And the democracies were full of hesitation. In 1935, Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, one of the last independent nations in Africa. His forces used poison gas against people with spears. The League of Nations condemned the attack and imposed sanctions. The sanctions were half-hearted. Britain and France, still hoping to keep Mussolini as a counterweight to Hitler, avoided the measures that might actually have stopped him. Ethiopia fell. The Emperor Haile Selassie stood before the League of Nations and delivered his warning to the world. It is us today. It will be you tomorrow. Nobody listened. The lesson that aggression paid had been delivered again. In Spain in 1936, a military revolt, led by General Francisco Franco, plunged the country into civil war. Germany and Italy rushed to support Franco. They saw Spain as a testing ground. Hitler sent the Condor Legion, a force of aircraft and personnel that practiced the tactics of modern aerial warfare on Spanish towns and cities. In April 1937, German aircraft bombed the Basque town of Guernica. The attack lasted several hours. The town was reduced to rubble. Hundreds of civilians were killed. Pablo Picasso painted the horror in black and white, and the image became one of the defining artworks of the 20th century. The democracies watched and did not intervene. Stalin sent weapons to the Spanish Republic, but the Republic was divided and outgunned, and by 1939 Spain was Franco's. Another fascist dictatorship had been born. The men who ran Britain and France in these years were not cowards or fools. They were men scarred by the memory of the last war. Neville Chamberlain had seen what modern war did to a generation. He believed with complete sincerity that if reasonable grievances could be addressed through negotiation, then war could be avoided. He was not blind to Hitler's nature, but he told himself that behind the rhetoric lay a rational man who could be reasoned with. The policy he pursued was called appeasement, and it would become one of the most debated words in political history. In 1938, Hitler moved against Austria. Austrian Nazis, encouraged by Berlin, created the conditions for German intervention. In March 1938, German troops crossed the border. In Vienna, crowds cheered. Flowers were thrown at soldiers. Austria was absorbed into the Reich in direct violation of Versailles. Britain and France protested. Nothing happened. Then, Hitler turned to Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland, the western region of Czechoslovakia, was home to more than 3 million ethnic Germans. Hitler claimed they were being oppressed. He demanded their liberation. The Czechoslovak government refused to surrender its defences without a fight. Europe came to the edge of war, and Chamberlain flew to Germany 3 times in 3 weeks to find a way back from the brink. In September 1938, the leaders of Britain, France, Germany and Italy met in Munich. Czechoslovakia was not invited to the conference that decided its fate. In a single night of negotiation, the Sudetenland was handed to Hitler. He promised it was his last territorial demand. Chamberlain returned to London, waving a piece of paper signed by Hitler. He stood outside Downing Street and told the waiting crowds that he had achieved peace for our time. The crowds cheered. They wanted to believe it. Winston Churchill did not believe it. Standing in Parliament, he told the House of Commons with quiet fury that Britain had suffered a total and unmitigated defeat. He was right. In March 1939, Hitler broke his promise and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. The mask was off. This was no longer about uniting Germans. This was conquest. And the next target was Poland. For Poland, Hitler had 2 demands: the return of the free city of Danzig and the right to build a road through the Polish corridor. Poland refused. Britain and France, finally understanding that appeasement had failed, guaranteed Polish independence. If Germany attacked, they would declare war. It was the line in the sand that should have been drawn years earlier. But before Hitler could move against Poland, he needed to protect his eastern flank. And so came one of the most astonishing diplomatic events of the 20th century. On August 23, 1939, the world woke to news that seemed almost impossible. Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia had signed a non-aggression pact. 2 ideological enemies who had spent years denouncing each other as existential threats had suddenly become partners. The Nazi-Soviet Pact, signed by Ribbentrop and Molotov in Moscow, contained public pledges of non-aggression. It also contained secret protocols that divided Eastern Europe between them like a carcass between two wolves. Poland would be split. The Baltic states would fall into the Soviet sphere. It was, on both sides, a cold and cynical calculation. For Hitler, it meant he could attack Poland without fear of a war on two fronts. For Stalin, it bought time. The Soviet Union was not ready for war. Its army had been gutted by his own purges. Better to let Germany and the Western powers exhaust each other while the Soviet Union rammed. It was a gamble that would very nearly cost him everything. At dawn on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. More than 1.5 million soldiers crossed the border from 3 directions at once. Tanks rolled through fields, aircraft screamed overhead, artillery tore apart defensive positions. The Poles fought with extraordinary bravery. At Westerplatte, a garrison of fewer than 200 men held out for 7 days against overwhelming force. Cavalry brigades fought German armoured divisions with a courage that inspired legends. In Warsaw, citizens built barricades with their own hands and prepared to die in the streets. But courage could not stop tanks, and Poland had no answer to the Luftwaffe's control of the skies. The Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, moved too fast for conventional defences to respond. For 2 days, Britain and France issued ultimatums. Hitler ignored them. On September 3rd, Chamberlain addressed the British people by radio in a voice heavy with grief and defeat. This country is at war with Germany. Hours later, France followed. But in Poland, no help arrived. The Allied armies sat behind the Maginot Line and did not attack. It was the beginning of what would be called the Phony War, a period of strange stillness on the Western Front, while Poland burned. On September 17th, the Soviet Union plunged the knife in from the east, invading Poland under the terms of the secret protocol. Crushed between 2 giants, Poland collapsed. The government fled into exile. By early October, organized resistance was over. Poland had been erased from the map once again, and in the areas now under German occupation, the machinery of racial terror began its first grinding movements. Jewish communities were forced into ghettos. Executions began. The darkest chapter of the war was already being written. The months that followed were strange and unsettling. On the Western Front, almost nothing happened. British and French soldiers sat in their prepared positions. German soldiers sat in theirs. Newspapers called it the Sitzkrieg, the sitting war, the phony war. Politicians wondered if perhaps a negotiated peace might still be possible. Some in Britain's war cabinet thought it worth exploring. Churchill, now First Lord of the Admiralty, disagreed with volcanic force. The war was real, and it would have to be fought. He was proved right sooner than anyone expected. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway in a single day. Denmark fell almost without resistance. Norway fought back and briefly seemed to hold, but the Germans secured the vital ports and pushed the Allied relief force out. And then, in May 1940, the storm broke in the west. On May 10th, Germany invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Allied armies marched north to meet them, as everyone expected they would. It was exactly what Hitler wanted. While the Allies moved north, the real blow was being delivered somewhere else entirely. Through the Ardennes. The Ardennes was a dense forested region of Belgium and Luxembourg that French military planners had dismissed as impassable for armoured forces. General Erich von Manstein had proposed using it as the main axis of attack. Hitler had seized on the idea with enthusiasm. As the Allies moved north to defend Belgium, 7 panzer divisions were threading their way through narrow forest roads in an operation of astonishing logistical complexity. When they emerged from the Ardennes and crossed the Meuse River at Sedan on May 13th, they found almost nothing in front of them. Open country. The road to the English Channel. The road to the sea. What followed was one of the most dramatic military collapses in history. The German armoured spearhead raced west, not south toward Paris as everyone expected, but toward the Channel coast. Within days, the Allied armies in Belgium were cut off from their supply lines and their reserves. The British Expeditionary Force and hundreds of thousands of French soldiers found themselves trapped against the sea near a small town called Dunkirk. The German panzers closed in. And then came the order that has mystified historians ever since. Hitler told the tanks to stop. The reasons for the halt order remain disputed. Perhaps he wanted the Luftwaffe to deliver the killing blow. Perhaps he was advised by his generals that the ground near Dunkirk was unsuitable for armour. Whatever the reason, the pause gave Britain 9 days. And in those 9 days, something extraordinary happened. A fleet of vessels of every imaginable kind, destroyers and ferries and fishing boats and pleasure craft, crossed the Channel again and again and lifted 338,000 men off the beaches. It was not a victory. Almost all the heavy equipment was left behind. But it was a survival, and Churchill, standing before Parliament, told the British people, with his particular gift for finding poetry in catastrophe, that wars are not won by evacuations. But then he told them that they would fight on the beaches and on the landing grounds and in the fields and in the streets, and that they would never surrender. Britain chose to fight on, and in that choice, the war was eventually decided. France did not make the same choice. On June 14th, German troops entered Paris. The city had been declared open to spare it destruction. Parisians stood on the pavements and watched in silence as German soldiers marched down the Champs-Élysées. A week later, in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, the same carriage in which Germany had signed its own armistice in 1918, French officials signed the terms of their defeat, while Hitler sat nearby, barely concealing his satisfaction. France was divided, the north under direct German occupation, the south a nominally independent government based in the spa town of Vichy, led by the aged Marshal Philippe Pétain, which chose accommodation with the conqueror over continued resistance. A junior general named Charles de Gaulle escaped to London and broadcast a message calling on France to resist. Almost nobody heard it. But it was the beginning of something. Now Hitler stood at the peak of his power. In little more than a year, he had conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Britain stood alone. His generals began planning the invasion of the island, Operation Sea Lion. But to cross the Channel, he needed to control the skies, and the skies over Britain belonged to the Royal Air Force. The Battle of Britain began in the summer of 1940. The Luftwaffe had numerical superiority. It had experienced pilots hardened by the campaigns in Poland and France. It had the momentum of an apparently unstoppable conquest. What it had not anticipated was the tenacity of fighter command. The RAF flew Spitfires and Hurricanes against the German Messerschmitts. They were guided by radar, a technology the Germans did not fully understand and consistently underestimated. They were directed by a command system of remarkable efficiency that put planes in the right place at the right time. And they were led by an Air Chief Marshal named Hugh Dowding, who understood that his task was not to win every engagement, but to remain undefeated. Day after day through July and August, German formations crossed the Channel. Day after day, RAF fighters rose to meet them. The losses on both sides were brutal. Pilots who survived one engagement were turned around and sent up again the same afternoon. Some flew 3 or 4 sorties in a single day. Many did not come back. The average life expectancy of a new pilot in the summer of 1940 was measured in weeks. Churchill visited Fighter Command's operations room and watched the display boards showing the RAF's squadrons committing to battle one by one. Afterward, he sat in silence for several minutes. Then he said, "Don't speak to me. I have never been so moved." He later told Parliament that never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The phrase was perfect, but it was the mathematics that mattered most. The Luftwaffe was losing pilots and planes faster than it could replace them. Britain was not. Then Hitler made his decisive mistake. After a British bombing raid on Berlin, enraged by the humiliation of having his capital attacked, he ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its focus from the RAF's airfields to London and other British cities. On September 7th, 1940, the Blitz began. 348 bombers crossed the Channel that first evening and set the East End of London ablaze. The fires were so large that they could be seen from the French coast. For 57 consecutive nights, London was bombed. Then the attacks spread to Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham, Bristol, Southampton, Plymouth. The suffering was enormous. More than 40,000 civilians were killed. Hundreds of thousands of homes were destroyed. Families sheltered in underground stations while bombs fell above them. Children were evacuated to the countryside with labels tied to their coats and gas masks slung over their shoulders. But the shift to city bombing gave the RAF the breathing room it needed. Airfields that had been hammered almost to breaking point were repaired and restocked. Pilots were rested and replaced, and by mid-September it was becoming clear that the Luftwaffe had failed. It had not broken the RAF. It had not broken British morale. Operation Sea Lion was quietly postponed. Eventually, it was cancelled. Britain had survived, and in surviving had changed the shape of the war. Hitler turned his attention east. He had always intended to turn east. The war against Britain was a distraction. The real war, the war that mattered, the war of racial ideology and living space, and the destruction of what he called Judeo-Bolshevism, lay in the vast spaces of the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. 3 million soldiers crossed the Soviet border on a front nearly 2,000 kilometers wide. It was the largest military operation in the history of the world. The Soviet Union was caught almost entirely by surprise. Despite warnings from British intelligence, from Soviet spies, from German deserters, Stalin had refused to believe that Hitler would break the pact so soon. The first hours of the invasion were catastrophic. Thousands of Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground before they could take off. Entire armies were encircled in vast pockets and forced to surrender. In the first weeks, Germany advanced hundreds of miles, capturing millions of prisoners in operations that seemed to confirm Hitler's prediction that this would be a campaign of weeks, not months. But the Soviet Union did not collapse as France had collapsed. It was simply too large, too vast, too deep. Its armies were huge and could absorb losses that would have destroyed any Western nation, and its people, driven by a combination of genuine patriotism, Stalinist terror, and the knowledge of what German occupation actually meant in the occupied territories, chose to fight. Stalin, who had spent the first days of the invasion in a state of apparent shock and paralysis, eventually found his voice. He addressed the nation as brothers and sisters. He invoked the memory of past invasions and past victories. He framed the struggle as a patriotic war for the survival of the motherland, and the Soviet people responded. The German advance continued through the summer and autumn. Leningrad was besieged. Kiev fell. The advance on Moscow reached the suburbs of the capital. Soviet citizens dug anti-tank ditches with their bare hands. Factories were dismantled and transported by rail beyond the Ural Mountains to be reassembled and continue producing weapons beyond the reach of German bombers. In December, fresh Soviet divisions, transferred from the Far East after intelligence confirmed Japan would not attack Siberia, launched a counter-offensive that pushed the Germans back from Moscow. For the first time, the seemingly unstoppable Wehrmacht had been stopped. The dream of a quick victory was dead. The war in the East would last 4 more years, and it would consume both nations in a furnace of suffering almost beyond human comprehension. While the Eastern Front consumed millions of lives, it was not the only theatre of war. In North Africa, the Desert War had been raging since Italy entered the conflict in June 1940. Mussolini's army had invaded Egypt from Libya and been repulsed with humiliating ease by a far smaller British force. Hitler had sent a rescue force under an extraordinary general named Erwin Rommel. Rommel's Afrika Korps rewrote the textbook on desert warfare. He moved fast, attacked where least expected, exploited success, and retreated from failure with an instinctive tactical genius that earned him the nickname the Desert Fox. For 2 years, British and Commonwealth forces traded the same ground back and forth across the Libyan desert in a campaign of exhausting saw battles. El Alamein, Tobruk, Benghazi. Names that became as familiar to British readers as towns in their own country. And then, on December 7th, 1941, everything changed. At dawn on a Sunday morning, Japanese aircraft attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. In less than 2 hours, they had sunk or damaged 8 battleships, destroyed nearly 200 aircraft, and killed more than 2,400 Americans. The attack was brilliant in execution and catastrophic in its strategic consequences. The following day, Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress. He called December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Adolf Hitler, in one of the great strategic miscalculations of the war, brought the industrial power of the world's largest economy into the conflict against him. Japan had been at war with China since 1937. Its military had argued that expansion across Asia was the only way to secure the resources Japan needed to sustain its industry. In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia with breathtaking speed. They took Hong Kong on Christmas Day 1941. They invaded Malaya and drove down the peninsula towards Singapore, which Churchill had called the Gibraltar of the East, largely because he had convinced himself that it would never be attacked from the land. It was attacked from the land. In February 1942, the garrison of 85,000 British, Australian and Indian troops surrendered to a Japanese force half their size. It was the largest surrender in British military history. Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The shock reverberated through the empire. The Japanese advance continued. The Philippines fell after months of desperate American resistance. Burma fell. The Dutch East Indies fell. Australia feared invasion. American naval power in the Pacific had been reduced to a handful of aircraft carriers that had not been in Pearl Harbor when the attack came. And it was those carriers that would decide the Pacific War. At the Battle of Midway, in June 1942, American naval cryptographers had broken enough of the Japanese code to know where and when the Japanese fleet would strike. Admiral Chester Nimitz set a trap. In a battle that lasted only a few minutes at its decisive moment, American dive bombers caught the Japanese carriers with their decks full of aircraft and fuel and bombs. 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sunk in an afternoon. Japan lost the core of its naval air power. It would never fully recover. The Japanese advance was stopped. The long and bloody process of rolling it back could begin. It was in the Soviet Union that the decisive blow of the entire war was being struck. In the summer of 1942, Hitler launched a new offensive, pushing south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city on the Volga that bore Stalin's name. Stalingrad, the battle that developed around that city between August 1942 and February 1943, was the largest and bloodiest in human history. The Germans fought their way into the city. The Soviets held on by their fingernails, fighting for every building, every factory floor, every staircase, every room. The city was reduced to rubble. The rubble became fortresses. The defenders became ghosts who emerged from the ruins to kill, and then melted back into the shadows. Whole divisions were consumed in days. The German Sixth Army, under Field Marshal Paulus, pushed deeper and deeper into the wreckage, while Soviet forces held the banks of the Volga and kept feeding reinforcements across under constant bombardment. In November 1942, the Soviets struck, not at the German forces inside the city, but at the weaker Romanian and Hungarian armies guarding the flanks. Operation Uranus was a masterpiece of deception and timing. 2 Soviet army groups crashed through the flanks and closed behind the Sixth Army. 300,000 Axis troops were encircled. Hitler ordered them to hold. He promised relief. The relief never came. The winter of 1942 was brutally cold. Supplies dwindled. The Luftwaffe's promised airlift delivered a fraction of what was needed. Men boiled leather for soup. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Frostbite took fingers and toes. On January 31st, 1943, Field Marshal Paulus, just promoted by Hitler, who expected him to die rather than surrender, instead surrendered the southern pocket. 2 days later, the northern pocket collapsed. Of the more than 300,000 men encircled at Stalingrad, fewer than 90,000 survived to march into captivity. Fewer than 5,000 would ever return to Germany. Stalingrad was the turning point. For the first time, an entire German field army had been annihilated. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Wehrmacht since 1939 was shattered. In occupied Europe, resistance movements took heart. In Germany itself, the propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels stood before a carefully selected audience in the Berlin Sportpalast and asked them if they wanted total war. The crowd roared yes. But outside the Sportpalast, the truth was different. The war was turning, and Germany did not have the resources or the manpower to turn it back. There is a chapter of the Second World War that cannot be understood as simply another aspect of a military conflict. It demands to be seen as what it was: the deliberate and systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others. The Holocaust. From the moment the Nazis came to power, They had targeted Jews with escalating persecution. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 stripped Jews of citizenship. Violence and humiliation were state policy. After Kristallnacht in November 1938, when synagogues burned across Germany and Austria, and Jewish businesses were smashed, and thousands of Jews were arrested and beaten, emigration was the only hope for those who could secure it. Many could not. When the war began, persecution became genocide. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 brought the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units that followed the German army and massacred Jewish communities across the occupied territories. At Babi Yar outside Kiev in September 1941, 33,000 Jews were shot in a ravine over 2 days. The shooting continued for months. Mass shootings were carried out across Poland, the Baltic states, Belarus and Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands were killed. Then, at the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, senior Nazi officials coordinated what they called the Final Solution, a program of systematic industrial murder. Death camps were constructed at Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno and Majdanek. Jewish communities from across occupied Europe were rounded up, packed into cattle cars and transported to these places. Those deemed fit for work were selected for slave labor. Those deemed unfit, the old, the sick, the mothers with young children, the children themselves, were taken directly to gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. They were told to remember their hook numbers so they could collect their clothes afterward. They never came out. 6 million Jews were murdered in this way. 1.5 million of them were children. Along with them were murdered hundreds of thousands of Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, Polish intellectuals, disabled people, gay men, and political opponents. The Holocaust was not a byproduct of the war. It was one of its purposes. And the world, when it discovered the full truth at the war's end, would never be able to say it had not been warned. By 1943, the tide of the war was turning on every front. In North Africa, the arrival of American forces following Operation Torch in November 1942 caught Rommel's Afrika Korps between 2 Allied armies. In May 1943, more than 250,000 Axis troops surrendered in Tunisia. The North African campaign was over. The Allies now controlled the southern shore of the Mediterranean. In July 1943, they used it to invade Sicily. The island fell in 38 days, and the political shockwaves reached Rome. On July 25, 1943, the fascist Grand Council voted to remove Mussolini from power. King Victor Emmanuel III had him arrested. Italians flooded the streets celebrating. The man who had strutted and boasted and promised them empire had been brought low. 6 weeks later, Italy signed an armistice with the Allies. But the Germans had anticipated the betrayal. They disarmed Italian forces, occupied the country, and in a daring glider operation, rescued Mussolini from his mountain prison and installed him as the puppet ruler of a German-controlled regime in northern Italy. The Allies fought their way slowly and bloodily up the Italian peninsula against German forces that turned every river and every mountain range into a fortress. The fighting at Monte Cassino, the ancient monastery that commanded the road to Rome, lasted through the winter and into the spring of 1944, and consumed lives at a rate that seemed almost medieval. Rome did not fall until June 4, 1944, 2 days before the greatest amphibious operation in history changed the war forever. June 6, 1944. D-Day. For 2 years, the Soviet Union had been demanding a second front. For 2 years, the Allies had been preparing one while conducting operations in North Africa and Italy to drain German strength and develop the skills they would need. The plan was called Operation Overlord, and it was the most complex military undertaking in history. On the English coast, nearly 7,000 ships had assembled. 156,000 men were waiting to cross the channel. Thousands of aircraft would provide cover. In the months before the invasion, an elaborate deception operation had convinced the Germans that the landing would come near Calais, the narrowest point of the channel. The real target was Normandy. In the early hours of June 6th, paratroopers dropped behind the beaches to secure the flanks. At dawn, the naval bombardment began, shaking the sea and the sky. Then the landing craft headed for the shore. 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. At most of them, the fighting was fierce and the losses heavy. At Omaha, the defenses were stronger than expected, and the preliminary bombardment had missed them. As the ramps went down, men walked directly into machine gun fire. The surf ran red. Bodies piled up at the water's edge. Officers were killed before they reached the beach. For hours, the outcome at Omaha was in doubt. Men lay behind tank obstacles in the breaking surf and wondered if they were going to die there. Some did, but others found the will to move. Small groups blasted gaps in the wire, scaled the cliffs, silenced the guns one at a time. By nightfall, Omaha was taken. The price was terrible. More than 2,000 American casualties on that single beach in a single morning. But the beach was taken. All 5 beaches were taken. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. The liberation had begun. The weeks that followed were hard. The bocage, the dense hedgerow country of Normandy, gave every advantage to the defender. German forces fought with the ferocious skill of an army that had been fighting for 5 years. The city of Caen, which the British had hoped to take on the first day, held out for weeks. But the Allies had the air power to prevent German reinforcements reaching the front in strength, and the industrial power to replace losses that would have broken any other army. In July, American forces broke through the German lines in Operation Cobra and raced south and then east. A German army was encircled at Falaise and largely destroyed. The road to Paris was open. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. French forces were given the honor of entering the city first. Crowds poured into the streets, weeping and cheering. Charles de Gaulle, who had refused to accept defeat in 1940 and had kept the spirit of Free France alive through 4 years of exile, walked down the Champs-Élysées, while crowds threw flowers and old men wept. Snipers were still firing from rooftops. The general walked calmly. The moment belonged to history, and he knew it. The liberation of France was not the end of the war, but it was the beginning of the end. Allied armies raced through Belgium and the Netherlands. Brussels was liberated. Antwerp fell with its port largely intact. For a brief moment, it seemed the war might be over before Christmas. It was not over before Christmas. In December 1944, Hitler launched a desperate counter-offensive through the Ardennes, the same forest through which his panzers had burst in 1940. He called it a last great gamble. The goal was to drive through to Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace in the West. For a few days, the attack succeeded in creating shock and confusion. German armor punched through thin American lines in thick fog that grounded Allied aircraft. The town of Bastogne was surrounded. The commander of the American 101st Airborne Division, General McAuliffe, received a German demand for his surrender. He sent back a one-word reply: "Nuts, The Germans were puzzled. The Americans understood it perfectly. The weather cleared. Allied air power returned to the skies. General Patton turned his Third Army 90 degrees and drove north to relieve Bastogne. The German offensive was blunted and then pushed back. The Battle of the Bulge cost more American casualties than any other battle of the war. But it cost Germany something it could not replace: its last armoured reserves. After the Bulge, there was nothing left to stop the Allied advance into Germany. From the east, the Red Army was coming too. In January 1945, the Soviets launched the Vistula-Oder offensive. 3 army groups crashed through German defences on a front hundreds of miles wide and advanced further in 2 weeks than any army had advanced in the entire war. They crossed Poland. They crossed into Germany. By February, Soviet forces were on the Oder River, less than 60 miles from Berlin. Hitler was in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, issuing orders to divisions that no longer existed, sacking generals who told him the truth, and insisting that the war was still winnable. The men around him were too frightened, or too loyal, or too implicated in his crimes to tell him what they knew: that the Reich was dying. In the West, Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945. American soldiers found a bridge at Remagen, still standing, and poured across before the Germans could blow it. The gateway to the heart of Germany was open. Both Allied armies raced east. They were also racing the Soviets to Berlin. Eisenhower made the decision not to drive for Berlin, calculating that the political prize was not worth the military casualties it would cost. Stalin had no such doubts. The capture of Berlin was both a military objective and a symbol of the greatest importance. He drove his marshals forward. The battle for Berlin began in mid-April 1945. Soviet forces encircled the city. Inside, Hitler mobilized the last remnants of a broken army, alongside boys from the Hitler Youth and old men from the Volkssturm, the People's Militia. He gave orders for a defense of the city that would leave it in ruins. He blamed the German people for failing him. If they had proven unworthy of him, then they deserved to perish. Buildings collapsed under artillery fire. Streets were choked with rubble and bodies. Soviet soldiers fought room by room through the ruins of what had been one of the great cities of Europe. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet forces within a few hundred yards of his bunker, Adolf Hitler shot himself through the head. Eva Braun, whom he had married the previous day, took cyanide beside him. Their bodies were burned in the garden above. On May 2nd, Berlin surrendered. On May 7th, Germany signed an unconditional surrender at Reims. The war in Europe was over. But the war in the Pacific continued. Japan had been losing for 2 years, but refused to contemplate surrender. American forces had fought their way across the Pacific island by island in battles of extraordinary ferocity. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima. Okinawa. At Iwo Jima, 6,800 Americans died to take an island 8 square miles in area. At Okinawa, 12,000 Americans were killed, and more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians died in fighting that lasted nearly 3 months. On the Japanese home islands, the military prepared for the American invasion they knew was coming. Women were being trained to fight with bamboo spears. Children were rehearsed in their roles as human shields. The military calculated that an Allied invasion would cost millions of Japanese lives and hundreds of thousands of American ones. The American president who had to make the decision about that invasion was Harry Truman. Roosevelt had died in April 1945, just weeks before Germany surrendered. and Truman had inherited the war and a secret that Roosevelt had not fully shared with him. For 4 years, the Manhattan Project had been working in hidden laboratories across America to build a weapon unlike any in human history, an atomic bomb. At Los Alamos in New Mexico, under the direction of the physicist Robert Oppenheimer, the brightest scientific minds of the age had solved the problem of splitting the atom and harnessing its energy as a weapon. On July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert, the first atomic device was tested. The flash was brighter than the sun. The mushroom cloud rose to 12,000 meters. Oppenheimer quoted from the Hindu Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Truman, at the Potsdam Conference in Germany, received the news of the successful test. He had a decision to make: use the bomb and force Japan's surrender, or launch a land invasion that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. Truman chose the bomb. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay dropped a uranium bomb called Little Boy on the city of Hiroshima. The bomb detonated 1,800 feet above the city. In an instant, 70,000 people were killed outright. The city simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form. People within a kilometer of the blast were vaporized. Their shadows were burned into walls. Buildings were flattened for miles. Fires swept what the blast had left standing. Those who survived the initial explosion suffered burns that stripped skin from bodies. And then came the radiation, invisible and lethal, killing in the days and weeks and months and years that followed. 3 days later, a second bomb, a plutonium device called Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. The geography of Nagasaki, its surrounding hills, limited the destruction somewhat, but more than 40,000 people died immediately. By the end of 1945, the combined death toll of the two bombs exceeded 200,000. On August 9th, the same day as the Nagasaki bombing, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. Japan now faced atomic destruction from America and conventional invasion from the Soviet Union. The military still argued for resistance, but on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed his people by radio. It was the first time most Japanese had ever heard his voice. He did not use the word surrender. He spoke of enduring the unendurable. But his meaning was unmistakable. The war was over. On September 2nd, 1945, Japanese officials signed the formal surrender documents aboard the US Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur presided. He spoke of a better world. The Second World War was over. The reckoning that followed was unprecedented in history. The Allied powers agreed that the leaders of Nazi Germany would not simply be executed or exiled. They would be put on trial. The Nuremberg trials, held in the city where Hitler had staged his most spectacular rallies, brought 22 senior Nazi officials before an international military tribunal. They were charged with crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The defendants included Hermann Göring, once heir apparent to Hitler and commander of the Luftwaffe; Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister who had signed the pact with Moscow; Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Wehrmacht's High Command; Rudolf Hess, who had flown to Scotland in 1941 in a deluded solo peace mission; Albert Speer, the armaments minister who claimed to be the good Nazi, the man who had served the regime without embracing its ideology. The evidence presented was overwhelming. Films of the concentration camps, documents in the meticulous German style, recording every deportation and execution, Survivor testimony from people who had looked into the face of industrialized murder and lived. The defense that defendants were simply following orders was rejected. Gring, defiant and intelligent, tried to dominate the proceedings and provide cover for his co-defendants. Speer tried to distance himself from the regime's crimes. Ribbentrop wept when confronted with documents he had signed. In October 1946, the verdicts came. 12 of the defendants were sentenced to death. 7 received prison terms. 3 were acquitted. Gring cheated the gallows by swallowing a cyanide capsule the night before his execution. The others were hanged in the early hours of October 16, 1946. Their bodies were cremated and the ashes scattered in a river to prevent the graves becoming shrines. The Nuremberg trials established principles that have shaped international law ever since. The principle that aggressive war is a crime against humanity. The principle that following orders is not a defense for atrocity. The principle that individuals, not only states, bear responsibility for crimes against humanity. These principles were imperfect and imperfectly applied. Critics noted that the bombing of Dresden and the atomic bombs were not examined. The Soviet massacre of Polish officers at Katyn, which Germany had actually been blamed for during the war, was quietly dropped from the indictment. The victors were judging the vanquished, not each other. But despite its flaws, Nuremberg was a beginning. The idea that power does not confer immunity, that there are laws above the laws of states, that some acts place their perpetrators beyond the protection of civilization. These ideas did not die at Nuremberg. They grew. What did the war leave behind? The numbers alone are staggering. More than 70 million people dead. Some estimates run higher. The Soviet Union lost between 25 and 27 million people. China lost somewhere between 15 and 20 million. Germany lost more than 7 million. Poland lost nearly 6 million, close to a fifth of its entire population. Japan lost more than 3 million. Britain lost nearly 500,000. The United States, which fought on 2 fronts and suffered enormous casualties, lost around 400,000. 115,000 Americans died in the Pacific. The physical destruction was equally staggering. Cities from Warsaw to Tokyo to Stalingrad to Hiroshima lay in ruins. Entire regions of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe had been reduced to something resembling the landscape of the moon. From the rubble, the world built something new. In 1945, representatives of 50 nations gathered in San Francisco to create the United Nations. The new body was imperfect, hamstrung by the veto power of its 5 permanent members, unable to act when the great powers disagreed. But it gave the world a forum, a place where disputes could be argued rather than fought. In 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights proclaimed that every person on earth possessed fundamental rights that no government had the authority to remove. In the same year, Israel was established as a Jewish homeland, an act directly connected to the world's belated recognition of what the Holocaust had done. Europe, exhausted and ruined, began to build structures of economic and political cooperation that would eventually make another European war unthinkable. The Marshall Plan, the great American program of post-war reconstruction, pumped billions of dollars into rebuilding Western Europe and making it prosperous enough that the conditions that had bred fascism could not easily return. But the war also left behind a new and terrifying reality. The atomic bomb. The weapon that had ended the war with Japan had demonstrated that humanity now possessed the means of its own extinction. Within 4 years, the Soviet Union had tested its own atomic device. The arms race had begun. The Cold War divided the world between two nuclear-armed superpowers and their satellite states for the next 4 decades. Europe was cut in two. An Iron Curtain, in Churchill's phrase, descended from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. Germany was divided into 2 countries. Korea was divided. China fell to communism. The liberation that the Allied victory had promised came only partially and conditionally. For the survivors, the war left marks that lasted a lifetime. Veterans who had seen things in the camps and on the beaches and in the streets of ruined cities that could not be unseen. Civilians who had lost everything. Jews who survived the camps and came out to find their families gone, their communities destroyed, the world they had grown up in erased. Children who had grown up in occupied Europe and had learned to live in a state of permanent fear. All of them carried the weight of the war forward into the decades of peace that followed. The Second World War was the most destructive event in human history. It killed more people, destroyed more cities, and reshaped more of the world than any other conflict before or since. It produced the Holocaust, the most systematic act of murder in recorded history. It ended with the detonation of weapons capable of destroying civilization entirely. It set in motion the decolonization of Asia and Africa, the decline of European power, and the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers. It created the modern world with all its promise and all its danger. And it remains, more than 80 years later, the event against which humanity measures its capacity for both destruction and renewal. The reminder that the worst that human beings are capable of can emerge from the same civilization that produced Beethoven and Shakespeare and Leonardo da Vinci. And the reminder that even in the darkest hours, when the odds seemed impossible and the enemy seemed unstoppable, something in human beings refused to yield. The few who flew their Spitfires into the summer sky over England, the defenders of Stalingrad who held a rubbled city against an army, the men who waded into the surf at Omaha Beach, knowing what was waiting for them, the women who kept the factories running, and the children fed while the men were gone, the partisans in the forests and the resistance fighters in the cities, and the prisoners in the camps who refused to surrender their humanity even when everything else had been taken. The story of the Second World War is the story of what human beings do to each other when civilization fails. But it is also the story of what human beings will endure and what they will sacrifice when they decide that some things are worth fighting for. That story does not belong to one nation or one generation. It belongs to all of us, and it demands to be remembered. The war in the Pacific had a character entirely its own. It was fought across thousands of miles of ocean on islands whose names most Americans had never heard before the war and would never forget afterward. It was a war shaped by the particular nature of Japanese military culture, by the code of Bushido that prized death in battle over surrender, and by the racist contempt on both sides that made the Pacific War, in some respects, more brutal than anything that happened in Europe. American soldiers were told that the Japanese were fanatics who would fight to the last man, and that taking prisoners was more dangerous than killing the enemy on the spot. Japanese soldiers were told that American soldiers were soft and decadent and would crumble when faced with true warriors willing to die for their emperor. Both sides were wrong about the other. Both sides would learn the truth at enormous cost. The island hopping campaign that carried American forces across the Pacific from 1942 to 1945 was a strategy developed by Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur, two men who agreed on little except the goal of reaching Tokyo. The strategy involved bypassing heavily fortified Japanese positions, leaving them to wither without supply, and seizing islands that could serve as air bases from which Japan itself could be reached. It was a strategy that saved lives compared to attacking every fortified position head-on. But the islands that were attacked with a ferocity that left survivors shaking for the rest of their lives. The Battle of Guadalcanal in 1942 and 1943 was the first major American ground offensive of the Pacific War. Marines landed on the island in August 1942 to seize an airfield the Japanese were building that would threaten the supply lines between America and Australia. What followed was 6 months of fighting in jungle heat that corroded equipment and men equally. Malaria and dysentery took as many men as Japanese bullets. At night, Japanese warships shelled the American positions. Japanese soldiers, renowned for their nighttime infiltration tactics, slipped through the American perimeter and killed men in their foxholes. The Marines held on. Reinforcements arrived. Slowly, the balance shifted. In February 1943, the remaining Japanese forces were evacuated. Guadalcanal was American. The long road to Japan had taken its first step. The road ran through Tarawa, where nearly 1,000 Americans died, taking an island barely 3 miles long in 76 hours of fighting so intense that officers estimated the casualties in advance and were nearly correct. It ran through Saipan, where Japanese civilians, told by their military that American soldiers would torture and kill them, threw themselves off cliffs into the sea rather than surrender. It ran through the Philippines, where General MacArthur, who had been ordered out of the islands in 1942 with the promise that he would return, waded ashore in October 1944 to fulfill his promise. The naval battle that accompanied the recapture of the Philippines was the largest in history. The Japanese fleet, attempting to destroy the American landing force, was shattered in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Japan had nothing left at sea, and still Japan fought. At Iwo Jima in February and March 1945, 22,000 Japanese defenders had turned the small volcanic island into a fortress of tunnels and bunkers and gun positions that covered every square foot of ground. The Marines who landed there faced fire from positions they could not see. After a week of fighting, they had taken half the island and lost more men than in any previous Pacific operation. The photograph of Marines raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi became one of the iconic images of the war. But the battle was not over. It continued for another month and cost the lives of nearly 7,000 Marines. Almost all of the Japanese defenders died. Okinawa, the last major battle before the planned invasion of Japan, was the bloodiest of all. The island was defended by 100,000 Japanese soldiers who had prepared layered defensive positions across its rugged terrain. The fighting lasted nearly 3 months. 12,000 Americans were killed. The Japanese lost more than 100,000 soldiers, and the civilian population of Okinawa, caught between the two armies, and in many cases ordered by Japanese officers to kill themselves rather than surrender to the Americans, suffered catastrophic losses. Perhaps 100,000 Okinawan civilians died. The battle convinced American planners that the invasion of Japan itself would be even worse. Estimates of American casualties ranged from 250,000 to over 1 million. The decision to use the atomic bomb was made in this context. Back in Germany, the last months of the war had a quality of nightmarish dissolution. As Allied armies closed in from west and east, the Nazi state continued to function. continued to kill. The death camps operated until the last possible moment. Prisoners who could still walk were driven on death marches away from the advancing Allied armies, marched through winter until they dropped, shot if they fell behind. The SS continued to execute anyone suspected of defeatism or of attempting to surrender. Deserters were hanged from lampposts with signs around their necks identifying their crimes. Even as the Reich collapsed around them, the machinery of terror kept running. Hitler himself had retreated from reality into the fantasies of his bunker. He pored over maps and moved phantom armies. He promoted officers to command units that no longer existed. He sacked generals who told him the truth. He raged at the German people for failing him, declaring in his political testament that they had proven themselves unworthy of him, and therefore deserved their fate. The man who had promised Germany greatness had brought it to rubble and ruin. The cities that had hosted his rallies were now moonscapes of collapsed buildings and exposed pipes and the smell of the unburied dead. The autobahns he had built were choked with refugees fleeing west ahead of the Red Army. The children who had sung his praises in the Hitler Youth were now being handed rifles and told to defend Berlin. As Soviet troops closed in on the city, Hitler celebrated his 56th birthday in the bunker on April 20th. A week later, he was dictating his last will and testament and bidding farewell to the few dozen people still with him underground. On April 30th, with Soviet soldiers fighting in the streets above his head and the noise of artillery shaking the concrete walls, he shot himself. The man who had started the war was dead. The city that bore the name of the man he had most despised fought on for 2 more days before surrendering. The German surrender was signed on May 7th at Reims in France. General Eisenhower, who had commanded the Allied forces in the West, refused to meet with the German delegation personally. He waited in an adjoining room while the documents were signed. Then he was brought in to acknowledge the surrender. He asked the German officers if they understood the terms and that they were the representatives of a beaten nation. They acknowledged that they did. He turned and walked out. The war in Europe was over. In London, crowds erupted in celebration. Churchill appeared on the balcony of the Ministry of Health building to a roar that could be heard for miles. In New York, Times Square filled with people who kissed strangers and wept with relief. In Moscow, Stalin ordered a salute of 1,000 guns. In Germany, many of the people who had supported Hitler simply fell silent. They had believed, and now they had to reckon with what they had believed in. The survivors of the concentration camps were the last and most terrible discovery. As Allied soldiers moved through Germany and Poland, they came upon places that their briefings had not prepared them for. Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Auschwitz, men and women who weighed 30 kilograms, barracks where the dead lay alongside the barely living because no one had had the strength to move them, pits filled with bodies, crematoria with their pipes and their ash. The soldiers who liberated these places, hardened by years of combat, broke down and wept. Some of them had to be ordered to stop giving food to the survivors immediately because the shock of eating after starvation was killing people who had survived everything else. Eisenhower ordered German civilians from nearby towns to be brought to the camps to see what had been done in their name. He anticipated that people would say this never happened. He wanted witnesses. He was right to want them. The post-war world that emerged from this catastrophe was not the world that the idealists of 1945 had hoped to build, but it was considerably better than what had come before in some respects, and considerably more dangerous in others. The United Nations was established in San Francisco in June 1945. Its charter spoke of saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war. It created mechanisms for collective security and international law. It gave the world a forum and a language for resolving disputes. It was imperfect, and it was limited by the rivalries of its most powerful members. But it existed, and that existence, in itself, was progress. Europe was divided. The Soviet Union, which had borne the greatest burden of the war and suffered the most devastating losses, was determined to ensure that it was never again attacked through the buffer states of Eastern Europe. Stalin imposed communist governments across Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. The free elections that had been promised at Yalta did not happen. An Iron Curtain descended across Europe. Germany, the cause of the catastrophe, was divided into two countries that would not be reunited for 45 years. The Cold War that replaced the hot war between the great powers was terrifying in its own right. Both superpowers built nuclear arsenals capable of destroying the human species. The world came close to nuclear war at least once in the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The shadow of the mushroom cloud that had ended the war in the Pacific hung over the entire post-war world. Japan, shattered and occupied, underwent a transformation under American occupation that remains one of the most remarkable political achievements of the 20th century. MacArthur ruled as a benevolent dictator. A new constitution was written that renounced war as an instrument of national policy. The emperor renounced his divinity. Land was redistributed. Women gained the vote. The militarists who had led Japan to catastrophe were tried, and many were hanged. And Japan, beginning from ruins, rebuilt itself into one of the great economic powers of the world. The country that had bombed Pearl Harbor and massacred the civilians of Nanking became, within a generation, a peaceful democracy. It was not without paradox and not without pain. But it happened. What had the war been about? At its heart, it had been about the challenge posed by fascism and militarism to the survival of civilization itself. The regimes that started the war were not simply aggressive nationalisms of the kind that had driven conflicts before. They were something new and something worse. They were ideological systems that denied the fundamental worth of human beings who did not fit their definitions of acceptable humanity. They operated through terror and murder and the deliberate erasure of peoples and cultures. They could not be negotiated with or appeased because they had no interest in a world that included those they had designated as enemies. They could only be defeated, and defeating them cost more than any previous human conflict in history. But the war was also about something else, about whether human beings, faced with a challenge of existential scale, could find in themselves the courage and the endurance and the solidarity to resist it. The answer that the war gave was yes, at extraordinary cost, at a price that should never be minimized or forgotten, at the cost of 70 million lives and the suffering of hundreds of millions more. But yes, the answer was yes. The pilots who held the line in the Battle of Britain, the defenders of Stalingrad who refused to yield the rubble of their city, the soldiers who waded ashore at Omaha Beach, knowing what was waiting for them, the resistance fighters who risked everything in the darkness of occupied Europe, the scientists who built the weapons, and the politicians who made the decisions, and the workers who kept the factories running, and the sailors who kept the convoys crossing the Atlantic, and the women who drove the buses and built the aircraft and raised the children alone. All of them together gave a yes to the question of whether civilization was worth defending. And the world they saved, imperfect and dangerous as it was better than the world that Hitler and his partners had intended to build. The Second World War ended 79 years ago. The last survivors are dying. The generation that fought it and endured it and rebuilt from its ruins is almost gone. What remains are the records, the photographs and the films and the documents and the memorials and the graves, the rows of white crosses in Normandy and the lists of names at the Holocaust memorials and the ruins preserved at Hiroshima and the museum at Auschwitz where millions of shoes are displayed in a pile. These things are the memory of the war. And memory is the only thing that stands between the lessons of the past and the disasters of the future. The Second World War happened because human beings in positions of power made choices that led to catastrophe. It was not inevitable. It was not the product of blind historical forces beyond human control. It was the result of decisions made by individuals. By Hitler and Stalin and Hirohito and Mussolini, and by the politicians who appeased them and the citizens who supported them and the bystanders who looked away. It could have been different at 100 points, and it can always be different. That is the final lesson of the most destructive war in human history. It was made by human beings, and it can never be allowed to happen again. The men and women who fought the war were not born soldiers. They were ordinary people who had been living ordinary lives when the world changed and demanded something extraordinary from them. A steel worker from Pittsburgh who found himself on a beach in Normandy, a school teacher from Birmingham who spent the Blitz in a shelter with her children and went to work in the morning to find half the street gone, a farmer from the Ukraine who came home from the fields to find German tanks in his village, a Jewish student from Warsaw who watched his world disappear building by building and street by street until the ghetto walls rose around what was left of it. A young Japanese man who had been told all his life that to die for the emperor was the highest possible honor, and who found at Iwo Jima that dying was simply dying, and there was nothing honorable about it. These were the people the war happened to, and their experiences, multiplied by tens of millions, constitute the true substance of the history. The soldiers who fought in the European theatre came from places as different as the American Midwest and the steppes of Siberia and the hill towns of Scotland and the deserts of Australia and the rice paddies of India. They were united by little except the uniforms they wore and the weapons they carried and the fact that they were far from home in places they had never imagined visiting and wanted never to see again. They wrote letters home that described the boredom and the fear and the cold and the mud, and carefully avoided describing what they had actually seen, because there were no words for it that their families could understand without having been there. They sent home photographs of themselves looking younger than they were, and grinning in ways that did not quite reach their eyes. Many of them never came home. Those who did came home changed in ways that took years and sometimes lifetimes to understand. The women of the war have their own history, long under-recognized and still not fully written. In Britain, the Women's Land Army sent hundreds of thousands of women to work on farms, doing work that had always been done by men, in all weathers and all seasons, keeping the country fed while the men were away. Women drove ambulances through bombed cities and worked as nurses in field hospitals close to the front, and cracked German codes at Bletchley Park, and ferried aircraft from factories to airfields for the Air Transport Auxiliary. In the Soviet Union, women served in combat roles with a directness that shocked German prisoners who had never expected to be captured by a woman. The Soviet night bomber regiment, known to the Germans as the Night Witches, flew obsolete wooden biplanes in the darkness and dropped their bombs and melted back into the night and terrified men who feared nothing else. In the United States, millions of women entered the workforce for the first time, working in shipyards and aircraft factories and proving beyond any possible argument that there was no industrial job they could not do. After the war, many of them were expected to simply go home and resume being wives and mothers. Some did, but the memory of what they had done and what they were capable of did not go away. It fed the movements for equality that would transform Western societies in the decades that followed. The children of the war carry it in different ways. The children who were evacuated from British cities in 1939 and sent to live with strangers in the countryside. Some of them found warmth and kindness and new lives that expanded their horizons. Others found neglect or cruelty and a loneliness so profound it lasted for the rest of their lives. The children who grew up in occupied Europe learned to be quiet in a way that no child should have to learn. They learned that the wrong word to the wrong person could bring disaster. They learned to read silences and to understand the difference between what was said and what was meant. They learned fear as a constant companion rather than a passing sensation. The children who survived the camps carried something that could not be named and would not fit into the language of any country they moved to afterward. Elie Wiesel, who survived Auschwitz as a teenager and later won the Nobel Peace Prize for his testimony about what happened there, spent the rest of his life trying to find words for an experience that exceeded the capacity of language. He did it because he understood that silence was a gift to the perpetrators. The experience of soldiers in the Pacific Theater was in some ways more brutal than anything that happened in Europe, partly because of the physical conditions of jungle warfare and the effects of tropical disease, and partly because of the nature of the fighting itself. The Japanese code of Bushido meant that surrender was not a realistic option for most Japanese soldiers. They fought to the last man, or they killed themselves. At Saipan, Japanese officers organized a final banzai charge of 4,000 men, many of them already wounded, against American positions. It was the largest banzai charge of the war. It killed nearly 1,000 Americans, and it killed all 4,000 Japanese. This was not military calculation. It was something closer to a ritual, a choice of death over the dishonor of defeat. Americans who fought in the Pacific could not understand it, and not being able to understand it made it more frightening, and in some cases made them less willing to offer the quarter that the rules of war required. The war produced acts of heroism so extreme that they challenged the imagination of anyone who was not there. At Brest in France, a unit of American Rangers scaled a cliff under fire at dawn to knock out gun emplacements that threatened the landing beaches. Half of them were killed or wounded before they reached the top. The guns they found there had already been moved. They held the cliff anyway and fought off German counterattacks for 2 days with whatever ammunition they had left, waiting for reinforcements that came too slowly. At Arnhem, in September 1944, British and Polish paratroopers were dropped deep behind enemy lines to seize a bridge across the Rhine. The plan called for relieving armor to reach them within 48 hours. The armor was delayed. The paratroopers held their positions for 9 days against overwhelming German force, fighting house by house through a Dutch town while waiting for relief that never quite reached them. The survivors were evacuated across the Rhine in the darkness. Of the 10,000 men who went in, fewer than 2,500 came out. But the courage of those 9 days became the stuff of legend. At sea, the men of the merchant marine paid a price that was for years not adequately acknowledged. They were not military men. They were sailors who had chosen to make their living on the sea and who found themselves sailing into the most dangerous waters in the world with no way of defending themselves against the submarines that hunted them. In the worst period of the Battle of the Atlantic, in 1942, a ship was being sunk somewhere in the Atlantic on average every 7 hours. The men who went down with those ships died in cold water far from shore and were often listed simply as missing at sea. They were not entitled to military honors or military pensions or the recognition that soldiers and airmen received. It took decades for their contribution to be properly acknowledged. The resistance movements that operated across occupied Europe were a phenomenon without parallel in modern warfare. Men and women who had been civilians before the war, farmers and teachers and shopkeepers and students, organized themselves into networks that passed intelligence to the Allies, sabotaged German operations, sheltered escaped prisoners and downed airmen, published underground newspapers, and maintained in the darkness of occupation the idea that the occupation would one day end. In France, the resistance was romanticized after the war to a degree that obscured its actual character. It was small in the years of German triumph and grew larger as Allied victory became more probable. Many of those who collaborated with the occupier before 1943 became resistors after Stalingrad, when it became clear which side was going to win. But there were genuine heroes from the beginning. Jean Moulin, who unified the scattered French resistance movements under de Gaulle's authority, was arrested by the Gestapo in 1943 and tortured to death. He did not give away the names of his colleagues. In Poland, the Home Army, the largest underground resistance movement in occupied Europe, fought a continuous war against the German occupier that culminated in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, in which 60,000 Polish fighters held the city for 63 days against a German force ordered to destroy it completely. The uprising ended in catastrophe. The Soviet army, which was close enough to have intervened, waited on the other side of the Vistula while the Germans destroyed Warsaw and killed 200,000 people. Stalin had decided that it was better for the Poles to be destroyed by the Germans than for the non-communist resistance to be the force that liberated Poland. It was one of the most cold-blooded calculations of the entire war. The air war over Europe had its own character and its own controversies that have never been entirely resolved. The RAF's Bomber Command, under the command of Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, adopted a strategy of area bombing of German cities that was explicitly intended to break the morale of the German civilian population. The logic was that if German civilians could be made to suffer sufficiently, they would pressure their government to end the war. It did not work. German morale, like British morale during the Blitz, proved more resilient than the bombers' theorists predicted. What the bombing did achieve was the destruction of German industrial capacity, the diversion of enormous German resources to air defense, and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of German civilians. The firebombing of Dresden in February 1945 killed somewhere between 22,000 and 25,000 people in a city that was already crowded with refugees. It was one of the most controversial acts of the entire war. Harris defended it. Others, including some within his own command, questioned whether the damage to an already collapsing Germany justified the scale of the destruction of civilian life. The debate has never entirely ended. For the air crews who flew the missions, the moral and physical dangers were constant. More than 55,000 members of RAF Bomber Command were killed in the war. The casualty rate was higher than in any other branch of the British Armed Forces. They flew into the most heavily defended airspace in history in aircraft that gave them almost no protection against the German flak and fighter defences. They flew at night because the losses in daylight were even higher. They flew cold and frightened and trusting in their comrades, and in the mathematics of a strategy they could see the effects of when they opened the bomb doors over burning cities below. Whether what they did was right remains one of the genuine moral questions of the war. The American air war over Europe was fought differently. The US Army Air Forces believed in precision daylight bombing. They would target specific industrial facilities, oil refineries, ball-bearing factories, aircraft production plants, and destroy the enemy's capacity to wage war at its root. The theory was sound. The execution was desperately expensive. Flying in daylight over Germany without fighter escort that could cover them all the way to the target and back, the American bombers suffered losses that were staggering. On October 14, 1943, 320 B-17 bombers attacked the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. 60 aircraft were shot down. More than 590 men were killed or captured. Another 121 aircraft were seriously damaged. It was the highest single-day loss in the history of the air war. The Schweinfurt mission was the end of unescorted deep penetration bombing. The development of the P-51 Mustang fighter, which had the range to escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back, changed the equation. The escort fighters did not just protect the bombers. They hunted the Luftwaffe wherever they found it, and slowly, methodically, destroyed the German Air Force's capacity to contest the skies over Europe. By D-Day, the Allies had achieved air superiority over Normandy that made the landing possible. The price had been terrible, but it had been paid. The final accounting of the Second World War is not merely a matter of numbers. Though the numbers are important, it is a matter of understanding what was at stake and what was saved. The regimes that started the war had a vision of the world that would have made it unrecognizable to anyone who believes in the worth of every human life. A world divided into masters and slaves. A world in which millions of people were systematically murdered for being who they were. A world in which the rule of law was replaced by the rule of force and the random cruelty of those who held power over those who did not. That world was defeated. It was defeated at incalculable cost. But it was defeated, and the world that emerged from the ruins of 1945, imperfect and dangerous as it was built on different principles, on the idea that human beings have rights that governments are bound to respect, on the idea that aggressive war is a crime, on the idea that what happened in the camps of occupied Europe must never happen again. These ideas have not always been honoured. The history of the decades since 1945 includes genocides and atrocities that should never have been allowed to happen, given what had just been witnessed. But the ideas exist. They were forged in the catastrophe of the Second World War, and they remain the best alternative humanity has found to the alternative that Hitler and his partners offered. The war that killed 70 million people also, in the ruins it left behind, planted the seeds of a world that has not yet destroyed itself. That is not nothing. That is, given where we started, something close to a miracle. The technological legacy of the Second World War shaped the world that followed in ways that are still being felt. The war accelerated the development of radar, which became the foundation of modern air traffic control and weather forecasting. It drove advances in aviation that made commercial air travel possible in the decades after the war. It produced the first electronic computers, created to help break German codes at Bletchley Park. And those machines are the direct ancestors of every computer and smartphone in use today. It produced penicillin as a mass-produced drug, saving millions of lives in the decades since. It produced jet engines that transformed transportation. It produced nuclear reactors that generate electricity. And it produced the nuclear bomb, which casts its shadow over everything else. The world after 1945 was a world made by the war. Its technologies, its institutions, its borders, its political structures, its fears, and its aspirations all carry the imprint of those 6 years. The war ended in 1945. Its consequences have not. The Japanese experience of the post-war period deserves particular attention because it was so unlike anything that had happened before in the history of conquest and occupation. MacArthur's occupation of Japan was in many ways an act of creation as much as administration. The Americans arrived expecting resistance and found a people who had been taught absolute obedience to authority and who transferred that obedience to the new authority with a discipline that astonished the occupiers. MacArthur himself was treated with something approaching the reverence that had previously been reserved for the emperor. The new constitution that the Americans drafted and imposed on Japan was arguably more democratic than any the Americans had written for themselves. It contained Article 9, which renounced war forever as an instrument of Japanese state policy. It gave women equal rights. It guaranteed freedom of speech and religion and assembly. It was imposed by a conqueror. But it took root. In the decades that followed, Japan rebuilt its economy with a ferocity of purpose that was recognizably related to the ferocity with which it had fought the war, and became one of the great economic success stories of the 20th century. And it remained at peace with its neighbors in a way that would have seemed impossible to anyone watching the Pacific War. For Germany, the post-war experience was more complicated. The country was divided into two. West Germany, occupied by Britain, France, and the United States, was rebuilt on democratic foundations with American money and political support. Its economy, destroyed in 1945, was rebuilt with extraordinary speed and became the engine of Western European prosperity. East Germany, occupied by the Soviet Union, became a communist state that was in many respects simply an extension of the occupation. Its people were not free to leave. When too many of them tried to leave through Berlin, the Soviet Union built a wall to stop them. The Berlin Wall stood until 1989 as the most visible symbol of the division of Europe and the unresolved legacy of the war. German society in the West spent decades working through its relationship with the Nazi past. It built memorials. It educated its children about the Holocaust. It prosecuted surviving war criminals. It paid reparations to the State of Israel and to individual survivors. It was an imperfect process, and it was resisted and debated every step of the way. But it happened, and the Germany that emerged from it was a country that bore no resemblance to the country that had followed Hitler to catastrophe. The question of collaboration and resistance has haunted the nations of occupied Europe ever since the war. In France, the myth of the resistance, carefully cultivated by de Gaulle for political purposes, held that the great majority of French people had resisted the occupation and that the collaborators were a small and unrepresentative minority. This was not true. The Vichy regime had governed France with the active cooperation of French officials and police and judiciary, and much of the business community. French police had rounded up Jews for deportation without being ordered to by the Germans. Ordinary French citizens had denounced their neighbors to the authorities for reasons that ranged from ideology to personal grudges to opportunism. When liberation came, the accounts were settled with a violence that killed thousands of people, whose guilt was often more assumed than proven. Women who had slept with German soldiers had their heads shaved in public. Men who had profited from collaboration were beaten or shot. Some of those who were punished deserved punishment. Others were innocent people caught in a settling of scores that had nothing to do with the war. France eventually had to confront this history honestly. It took decades. The confrontation is still not complete. The Soviet Union's experience of the war and its legacy is the hardest of all to write about with any brevity, because it was the most extreme in almost every dimension. The Soviet Union lost more people than any other combatant nation. Its western regions were occupied and devastated in a way that left marks that are still visible in the landscape today. Its people endured suffering on a scale that other combatant nations, however terrible their own losses, did not approach. And yet, the Soviet Union was also a dictatorship that killed its own people in numbers that rivaled the death tolls of the war itself. The purges of the 1930s had killed hundreds of thousands. The forced collectivization had starved millions. The gulags imprisoned and killed millions more. The war was won by the Soviet people, who fought with extraordinary courage and endurance. But the political system that directed that courage was one of the most repressive in human history. The victory of 1945 consolidated rather than reformed that system. Stalin used the prestige of victory to extend his control, and his purges resumed after the war with their pre-war ferocity. The Soviet people, who had sacrificed so much to defeat one totalitarianism, emerged from the war still living under another one. Their liberation would take another 46 years. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 was one of the most direct consequences of the Holocaust and one of the most contested acts of post-war politics. The Zionist movement had been campaigning for a Jewish homeland in Palestine for decades before the war, but it was the Holocaust that made the argument for a Jewish state unanswerable in the eyes of the world's conscience and irresistible in the politics of post-war settlement. 6 million Jews had been murdered in a continent that had promised them citizenship and protection and had delivered genocide. The survivors of the camps and the Jews who had escaped Europe before the war were not going back. They were going to Palestine. The British, who held the mandate for Palestine, tried to limit Jewish immigration and were caught between the demands of the Jewish community and the resistance of the Arab population that had lived there for generations. In May 1948, the British withdrew and Israel declared independence. The Arab states that bordered it immediately attacked. Israel survived the war that followed. But the conflict between the Jewish state and the Palestinian people, who had been displaced to make room for it, has continued ever since. It is one of the longest and most painful of the war's unresolved legacies. The war produced in the men who fought it and survived it a generation marked by experiences that set them apart from everything that came before and everything that came after. The men who stormed the beaches of Normandy, and the men who survived the siege of Leningrad, and the men who flew bombing missions over Germany, and the men who fought in the jungles of the Pacific, came home to a world that could not fully comprehend what they had been through. Many of them did not try to explain it. They came home and got jobs and married and had children and built the prosperous post-war world that their children and grandchildren grew up in. They were stoic in a way that was partly the product of their generation's culture and partly the product of experiences that they had decided, consciously or not, were better not shared. Some of them drank too much. Some of them had nightmares for the rest of their lives. Some of them were patient and gentle fathers, and some of them were angry and distant ones. All of them had been changed by what they had seen and done in ways that they were not always able to articulate or even understand. The war's final accounting belongs not to any government or any general, but to the ordinary people who lived through it and paid its price. The woman in Stalingrad who dug anti-tank ditches with her hands in October 1942 and did not know whether she would be alive in December. The boy in Poland who watched the walls of the ghetto go up and understood what they meant. The sailor in the North Atlantic who spent 3 years of his life crossing and recrossing the most dangerous stretch of water in the world, knowing that the submarine might come at any hour of any day or night. The prisoner in the camp who woke each morning to another day that could not be endured and endured it anyway. The soldier at Omaha Beach who lay behind a tank obstacle in the surf and decided to get up and move forward when every instinct was telling him to stay down. The child in Hiroshima who was walking to school at 8:15 on the morning of August 6, 1945. These are the people the war was made of, and these are the people whose memory demands that it never be made again. The Second World War is the central event of the 20th century. Everything before it in that century led toward it, and everything after it led away from it. The empires that it ended, the institutions it created, the weapons it developed, the borders it drew and redrew, the ideas it discredited, and the ideas it validated. All of these shape the world we live in with a directness that no other event in the last 100 years can match. When we talk about human rights, we are using a language that the war made necessary. When we talk about genocide, we are using a word that the war made essential. When we talk about the United Nations, or NATO, or the European Union, we are talking about structures built in direct response to the catastrophe of the war. When we talk about the nuclear age, we are talking about a reality that the war brought into existence and that has defined every moment of international politics since. The war is over. Its consequences are everywhere. It began in the silence after the guns stopped in 1918. It ended in the silence over the ruins of Hiroshima and the ruins of Berlin and the ruins of 100 other cities that had been reduced to dust and memory by the most destructive event in human history. Between those two silences lay 6 years that tested every human quality that can be named: courage and cowardice, loyalty and betrayal, sacrifice and brutality, heroism and genocide, hope and despair. The capacity of ordinary people to endure the unendurable, and the capacity of the same civilization that produced art and music and philosophy and medicine to produce also the gas chambers of Auschwitz and the mushroom cloud over Nagasaki. Both things are true. Both are part of the same story. And the story must be told whole, without sentimentality, without jingoism, and without the comfortable distance that time provides, if we are not careful to resist it. The Second World War happened. It was made by human choices. And it remains, more than any other event in living memory, the clearest argument the human record provides for why we must choose better.